Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on education. We're looking at the powerful and often totally invisible ideas that have shaped every single lesson, every test, and every classroom activity you've ever been a part of. Let's get right into it.
So, have you ever stopped to think about this? Why does a spelling bee, with all the repetition, the drills, the instant feedback, feel so worlds apart from a science fair? I mean, a science fair is all about exploring, collaborating, building something totally new with your team. They're both about learning, right? So what gives? Why are they so different?
Well, the answer goes way deeper than just the subject matter. It's actually about these fundamental beliefs, these theories, about how our brains work and how we actually learn stuff. These theories are like the secret blueprints that teachers use to design absolutely everything, from a simple multiplication drill to a massive, complex project.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with that big central question. How do we even learn? Then we'll journey through 4 major schools of thought that focus on our behavior, what's going on inside our minds, how we learn from others, and our own personal growth. And finally, we'll see how all of these ideas come together in what you could call the modern teacher's toolbox.
Okay, let's dive right in with the question that started it all, the one that every one of these theories is desperately trying to answer. How do we actually truly learn?
The first major attempt to answer this didn't even try to look inside our heads. Nope. Instead, it focused entirely on what you could see and measure from the outside, our actions. Welcome to the world of behaviorism. This whole idea, which grew out of the work of people like B.F. Skinner, basically argues that learning is nothing more than a change in your behavior. It's all about conditioning. It's simple, really. You get a reward for doing something right, and you get a correction for doing something wrong. That's it. In this model, the classroom is basically a stage. The teacher is the director, calling the shots, giving out cues and corrections. And the student is the responder, whose job is just to follow the cues and mimic the right patterns over and over until they become habits. This is the exact theory behind stuff like flashcard drills or those language apps that give you instant feedback.
Now, behaviorism is fantastic for things like rote memorization, but it leaves this huge gaping hole in the theory, right? What about creativity? What about critical thinking and problem solving? What about, actual understanding? What in the world is going on inside our heads?
And that very question, it sparked a complete revolution. The focus suddenly shifted, moving away from just outward behavior to what's happening inside our brains, the mental processes of the learner. This is where we get into the cognitive theories.
The big idea here, the central metaphor, is that the brain is basically a computer. So learning is all about inputting information, processing it, and then storing it in a nice, organized way, kind of like files on a hard drive. The student is the processor, and the teacher's role changes to an architect who has to carefully design lessons to feed that information in a logical way that doesn't cause the system to crash.
But then, one of the biggest names in this field, Jean Piaget, came along and took it a step further. He said, hang on a second, we're not just passive computers that you download information onto. He saw learners, especially kids, as little scientists. For him, knowledge isn't something that's just given to you, it's something you have to actively build for yourself by getting your hands dirty, by exploring and experimenting, and just making sense of the world around you. And here's Piaget's key insight. Our ability to learn is completely tied to our stage of logical development. I mean, a 7-year-old just thinks in a fundamentally different way than a teenager who can handle really abstract ideas. So, for a teacher, the job becomes understanding what stage a kid is at and giving them challenges that they're actually ready to tackle. So Piaget was really focused on that individual scientist working alone in their lab. But what about their lab partners? The next wave of theories came along and argued that we don't just learn inside our own little bubble, a huge part of learning happens together. And this is the world of Lev Vygotsky. His big idea, social constructivism, says that learning is at its core a social activity. Our language, our culture, that's the framework we use to understand everything. And we don't just build knowledge on our own. We build it by talking, by debating, and by creating things with other people. It's co-constructed. So you can see the huge difference here, right? For Piaget, the learner is that solo scientist making individual discoveries. But for Vygotsky, the learner is a social participant, and the group itself is the engine of learning. This is the whole theory behind things like group projects, class discussions, and having students teach each other.
Another giant in this space is Albert Bandura, and he pointed out something that is so obvious once you hear it, but also kind of profound. A massive amount of what we learn comes from simply watching other people. His social learning theory explains that we don't always need direct rewards or punishments. We can learn just by observing what others do, imitating them, and modeling their behavior.
And Bandura broke this process down into 4 simple steps. First, you have to pay attention, like you're watching a pro chef chop an onion. Then, you have to retain that technique, storing it in your memory. Next, you have to actually be able to physically reproduce the action. And finally, you need the motivation to even try it yourself, maybe because you really want to cook an amazing dinner.
Okay, so far we've covered behavior, we've covered the mind, we've covered social interaction. But what about the learner as a whole person? What about their feelings, their personal goals, their sense of well-being? And that brings us to humanism. This theory, developed by thinkers like Abraham Maslow, was basically a direct pushback against that cold, almost mechanical view of behaviorism. The core belief of humanism is that students are naturally good people who want to learn. The main thing holding them back isn't a lack of discipline, it's that some of their basic needs aren't being met.
So, a humanistic classroom puts the student right at the center of everything. They become the self-director, and the teacher's role shifts to being a supporter or a guide. The focus totally changes. It becomes about giving students choices, valuing their own self-evaluation more than just grades, acknowledging that feelings and learning are connected, and most importantly, creating a safe, supportive environment where students feel secure.
So, after all these different competing theories, where does that leave a teacher today? I mean, which one is right? Well, the answer isn't about picking just one. It's really about building a well-stocked toolbox. The real answer is that they all have a place. A great modern teacher doesn't just pick one theory and stick to it for everything. No way. They have this amazing toolbox, and they know which tool to pull out for which job. They might use a behaviorist approach with flashcards to memorize multiplication tables, then switch to a social constructivist model for a big history debate, and then use a humanistic focus on student choice for a final passion project. It's all about mixing and matching. And that toolbox, well, it's always expanding. In our hyper-connected digital world, there's this new emerging idea called connectivism. And it suggests that learning today isn't just about what you know in your own head, but about your ability to find, navigate, and connect bits of information across vast networks. So you see, these theories aren't just academic concepts for a textbook. They literally build the world we learn in. From the spelling bee all the way to the science fair, they are always there, working behind the scenes. And that really just leaves us with one final thought for you. If you were handed a blank slate and told to design a school from scratch, which one of these powerful ideas would be your foundation?